What happens when a prince enters a courthouse expecting victory and leaves a loser? On this day, a calculated appearance turned into a public disaster. The heavy doors of the High Court of Justice closed behind Prince Harry, and with them, a strategy years in the making crumbled. What began as another step in his personal crusade against the tabloids ended as a moment of stark disillusionment. No satisfaction, no moral triumph, no sign of acknowledgement, only silence. And a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Observers described his departure as cold and wordless. No glance at the camera, no gesture of defiance. Instead, the visible weight of a man realizing that a risky gamble had failed. Prince Harry had arrived expecting his story, his experiences, and his public status to carry weight. But the court was not a television studio, not a place for emotional settling scores. It was an arena of rules, deadlines, and evidence, and that is precisely where the house of cards began to crumble. The core of the problem lay not in moral outrage, but in the cold logic of the law. While headlines outside spoke of a setback, a much harsher picture was emerging inside. A legal rebuke that called the entire approach into question. Mr. Justice Fanker wasn't focused on feelings or narratives, but on numbers, dates, and deadlines. The gaze wasn't directed back to personal grievances, but to the calendar, and that calendar became the day's toughest opponent. The attempt to rehash decades-old allegations felt like fighting a shadow from the past. Time, usually a silent companion, transformed into an insurmountable wall. The question of why this lawsuit was being brought now struck at the heart of the argument. The longer the proceedings went on, the clearer it became. This wasn't about assessing suffering, but about adhering to rules. And rules make no exceptions, not even for a prince. The atmosphere in the courtroom noticeably shifted as it became clear that the emotional approach was not working. The strategy, built on public sympathy, clashed with the court's cold objectivity. The decades-long delay was interpreted not as a tragic misunderstanding, but as a grave error. At that moment, the case lost its luster and became a lesson in how merciless the legal system can be when deadlines are missed. What made this moment so explosive was the discrepancy between expectation and reality. Prince Harry had hoped that the significance of his story would break the legal constraints. Instead, it became clear that the court measures not in emotions, but in legal statutes. The proceedings devolved into a dismantling of the approach long before a final verdict was reached. Every subsequent sentence seemed to widen the gap between aspiration and reality. Outside the courtroom, the reinterpretation had already begun. Was this merely a technical setback, or the beginning of a comprehensive failure? Initial reactions suggested that more than just a single trial was at stake. It was about credibility, about strategy, and about whether this battle could still be won. The supposed breakthrough turned into a symbol of hubris. In the end, a bitter impression remained. A man who had arrived with high expectations suddenly stood before the ruins of a plan that relied on emotions where the law accepts only facts. The very nature of this legal drama indicated that it wasn't about a minor setback, but about the potential loss of control and direction. Was this the moment when a public champion became a victim, or merely the first act of an even larger conflict? Why could a case with such media impact fail over a seemingly dry formality? This was precisely the explosive element of the proceedings. While the public debate focused on morality, the media, and personal grievances, the court highlighted an aspect that, for seemingly insignificant legal arguments, can be fatal: time. The factor of time became the invisible trap in which Prince Harry's entire endeavor became entangled. At its core was the principle of veneration. It is one of the harshest rules in the British legal system because it makes no allowances for prominence or emotional ramifications. The basic idea is simple: those who wait too long lose their right to sue. What sounds abstract in theory became a bitter reality in the High Court of Justice. The alleged incidents lay far in the past, stretching back years, decades. This very passage of time became the core of the legal argument against the plaintiff. Mr. Justice Fgorker focused relentlessly on this point. While the public discourse revolved around personal traumatic events, The judge remained unmoved. The crucial question was not whether something had happened, but when and why action had been taken so late. This perspective transformed the entire nature of the proceedings. What had been a moral clash became a sober examination of deadlines and omissions. The attempt to turn back the clock increasingly resembled a battle against a firmly entrenched system. The court made it clear that the statute of limitations is not a technicality, but a fundamental pillar of the law. It not only protects defendants from endless legal proceedings but also guarantees legal certainty. In this context, Prince Harry's belated intervention appeared less as a courageous act and more as a risky maneuver that ignored the rules of the game. Particularly explosive was the fact that the temporal dimension was not new. Indications that knowledge of potential events had existed earlier raised further questions. The court interpreted these circumstances not as an excuse but as proof that timely action would have been possible. Thus, the delay transformed from an unfortunate circumstance into a central weakness of the entire case. The effect of this assessment was devastating. With every reference to deadlines, the emotional narrative lost ground. The portrayal of a long-standing injustice could not overturn the simple calculation. Years had passed without any legal action being taken. In the court's logic, this did not signify compassion, but rather consistency. The case began to unravel long before a final decision was reached. While outside the headlines reported on a high-profile trial, inside a quiet end was taking shape. The legal debate increasingly narrowed to the question of whether there was any room for maneuver left at all. And the clearer the answer became, the more apparent it was that the vilification acted like a guillotine. It allowed no gray areas and severed the core of the argument. This phase of the proceedings revealed a fundamental discrepancy between public expectation and legal reality. Many had assumed that the seriousness of the allegations would automatically lead to a substantive debate. But the court signaled unequivocally, without timely action, there is no stage for moral reckoning. The rules take precedence over history. In the end, the realization remained that in law, time is not just a number but power. It determines who is heard and who is not. For Prince Harry, this meant that the fight failed not because of the credibility of his narrative, but because of the inflexibility of the calendar. Was this delay a fatal mistake, or the moment when his personal crusade finally collided with reality? As it became clear that time was working against him, the focus shifted to one last hope. The legal pressure mounted, and with it the search for a way out of the statute of limitations trap. At that moment, a claim came to the fore that could save the entire case, should the alleged secret be revealed. This narrative was more than a tactical move. It was an attempt to explain the standstill of the statute of limitations while simultaneously deflecting responsibility. The presentation was explosive. Prince Harry had it asserted that it was not inaction or hesitation that had prevented him from filing an earlier lawsuit. Rather, he had been bound by an internal agreement, a pact that allegedly existed behind the scenes between the palace and the media. This agreement, so the argument went, had prevented legal action from being publicly initiated. It was meant to explain why the path to court had been blocked for so long. For a moment, this theory seemed capable of turning the tide. Had such an agreement been recognized, it would have broken the rigid logic of the statute of limitations. The case would have taken on a new dimension, a political and institutional one. But this is precisely where the story began to unravel, because in a courtroom, what matters is not the plausibility of a narrative, but its verifiability. Mr. Justice Funcord examined the claim step by step, not with sentimentality, but with methodical detachment. The central question was, where is the evidence? Written agreements, formal documents, or unambiguous traces would have been necessary to substantiate the existence of such an agreement. But all of this was lacking. The account remained ambiguous, the hints, the indirect evidence, vague. The longer this argument was examined, the more clearly a problem emerged. The alleged agreement seemed neither clearly defined nor unequivocally documented. Even legal representatives from the period in question did not appear as witnesses to a binding arrangement. Thus, the story appeared less like a legal fact and more like an afterthought born out of the necessity of the proceedings. The court also noted that there had been indications of prior knowledge and consultation. These aspects contradicted the claim of having been completely blocked. Instead of enforced silence, the picture that emerged was one of a complex decision-making process, but one not necessarily driven by external constraints. In this interpretation, the secret agreement lost its life-saving function. The impact of this assessment was profound. With the collapse of this line of argument, no basis remained to circumvent the statute of limitations. What had been intended as a last resort turned out to be a weakness. The judges saw no sufficient grounds to stop time or restart it. The door that would have allowed a fresh start remained closed. This turn of events also had a symbolic dimension. The idea of a hidden system that steers decisions and binds individuals was a powerful narrative. But in the courtroom, this narrative transformed into a hypothesis without substance. The contrast between public expectation and legal assessment could hardly have been greater. What sounded emotionally convincing was legally insufficient. At the end of this section came the sobering conclusion that the secret agreement offered no salvation. Instead, it reinforced the impression of a desperate maneuver. The attempt to deflect responsibility not only failed but also exposed the fragility of the entire strategy. Was this claim a calculated move that backfired, or a sign of how far the case had already spiraled out of control? With the collapse of the legal lifeline, a comparison came into sharp focus that was particularly painful for Prince Harry. While his own case foundered in court on procedural hurdles, a fact emerged that cast the entire conflict in a new light. Prince William had walked the same path and had long since overcome it. Quietly, discreetly, and successfully. This contrast transformed the defeat into a personal dismantling. The files revealed that Prince William had also been affected. He too had had to deal with the same media. He too was part of the same story. But the way he proceeded was fundamentally different. While Prince Harry sought a public battle, Prince William had chosen the legal route behind closed doors. No headlines, no escalation, no public self-promotion. The result was clearly a closed conflict with no loss of face. This juxtaposition captured the essence of the drama. Two brothers, the same starting point, completely different strategies. One relied on publicity, morality, and confrontation. The other on discretion, timing, and control. The court didn't explicitly highlight this difference, but it was implied. The comparison was inevitable and raised the question of why identical circumstances led to such contrasting results. What was particularly explosive was that the details of Prince William's actions didn't emerge by chance. They surfaced in the context of the failed legal proceedings and reinforced the impression of an involuntary revelation. What was intended as an argument for his own justification backfired. Instead of providing support, it revealed that an alternative had existed and had been pursued. At this stage, public perception shifted. The focus moved from a supposed battle against an all-powerful system to an analysis of decisions and their consequences. Prince Harry no longer appeared as an isolated lone fighter, but as someone who had consciously or unconsciously rejected another option. The comparison with Prince William suggested that strategic decisions, rather than external constraints, had been the deciding factor. The symbolism was unmistakable. Prince William operated behind the scenes, resolving the problem and protecting the larger structure. Prince Harry chose open conflict and found himself at the center of a legal defeat. This dynamic reinforced the narrative of two lives that had inexorably diverged. One path led to stability, the other to escalation. For observers, this was the moment when the roles became definitively entrenched. The comparison acted as a silent judgment on priorities and self-perception. While one brother utilized the mechanisms of the system, the other attempted to transcend it. But systems cannot be overcome by outrage. They reward conformity and punish transgression. At the end of this section, a bitter picture remained. The legal defeat was amplified and emotionally charged by the family comparison. It was no longer simply a matter of right and wrong, but of foresight and consistency. Was this the point at which Prince Harry realized that not all battles are won with sheer volume, or the moment when the rift between the brothers finally widened? With the substantive failure came the reckoning, and it was harsher than many had anticipated. For beyond the public humiliation and strategic blunder, the proceedings revealed a particularly merciless dimension: the financial consequences. At that moment, the trial transformed from a symbolic battle into a real burden with immediate repercussions for Prince Harry. The British legal system operates on a principle often underestimated by outsiders: the loser pays. Not only their own costs, but also those of the opposing side. With the dismissal of key parts of the lawsuit, this very mechanism kicked in. The legal defeat meant not merely the end of a trial, but the beginning of an avalanche of costs. Lawyers, expert opinions, procedural expenses. All of this added up to sums that could quickly reach 7 figures. What was particularly alarming was that this development did not happen suddenly. Earlier decisions in the proceedings had already hinted at the direction things were headed. Payments had been ordered at previous stages, which could have served as a warning signal. But the course remained unchanged. Instead of retreat or adjustment, escalation ensued. With each step, the risk increased, and with the final failure, it exploded. In public discourse, the focus was on principles, justice, and a supposed fight against overwhelmingly powerful structures. But in the day-to-day reality of the legal system, something else was at stake: settling scores. The opponents possessed enormous resources and a sophisticated defense strategy. With a lost case, the dynamic reversed. The plaintiff became the payer, the aggressor the one who had to finance the defense. This aspect lent the entire drama a new edge. Paradoxically, the attempt to hold the media accountable only strengthened these very structures. Every lost step meant further payment obligations. The moral imperative clashed with economic reality, and this reality showed no mercy. Observers spoke of a financial dead end. While settlements had been quietly reached elsewhere, this path offered no shortcut. The proceedings were publicly complex and expensive. The thought that a single lawsuit could consume a significant portion of previous revenues came to the fore. This gave the dispute an existential dimension. During this phase, the perception of the entire process also shifted. What had previously been portrayed as a courageous fight now appeared as a risky, high-stakes gamble. The question arose whether the costs were still proportionate to the potential benefits, because the benefits had vanished. The ideal gain remained abstract, while the financial burden was concrete and measurable. The case exemplified how quickly a legal offensive can transform into a burden. The loss of money went hand in hand with the loss of control. Decisions that had once been seen as expressions of determination now appeared as chain reactions that were virtually unstoppable. The narrative of the resolute fighter gave way to the image of a man who had become entangled in a system whose rules he had underestimated. At the end of this phase, a sobering assessment emerged. The price of failure was high, not just symbolically but literally. The costs became a visible sign that this path had reached its limits, not only emotionally but also economically. Was this the point at which the struggle finally became too expensive, or merely another stage in an escalation with no turning back? At the end of this legal drama, there was no redemption but disillusionment. The final act revealed that the entire endeavor was based on a fundamental misconception: the hope of catharsis through the legal system. The courtroom became a projection screen for expectations it could never fulfill. Instead of recognition or healing, the proceedings delivered a cold lesson about limits, jurisdictions, and consequences. The approach of transforming emotional truth into legal recognition proved to be a fallacy. The law does not measure in violations, but in deadlines, jurisdictions, and evidence. This is precisely where aspiration and reality collided. While the public narrative aimed at reconciliation and moral clarity, the court demanded precision and timeliness. This discrepancy determined the outcome. The dynamics of the trial demonstrated how dangerous it is to confuse different arenas. In public, narratives can be compelling, generating sympathy and mobilizing support. In court, however, different standards apply. The procedural logic left no room for emotional compensation. Every line of argument was reduced to its legal viability. What remained was a sober assessment devoid of solace. This realization had far-reaching consequences for overall perception. The trial debunked the notion that moral urgency could override legal rules. Instead, it affirmed the stability of a system that enforces equal treatment. The case served as an example of how status offers no shortcuts and outrage does not extend deadlines. At the same time, a psychological dimension was revealed. The attempt to repair the past led to an escalation in the here and now. The search for validation shifted to an institution not designed for this purpose. The result was not healing, but a further loss of control. With each decision, the scope for action narrowed. The conclusion of this chapter felt so final because it left no gray area, no acknowledgement of motives, no compensation for the effort, no symbolic reconciliation, only a formal end and an open debt. The court had spoken not about feelings, but about jurisdiction, and thus the path intended as liberation had become a dead end. This development raises a larger question. What happens when personal expectations of justice clash with institutional logic? The case demonstrated that systems don't heal, they order. Anyone expecting healing from them risks disappointment. The consequences are measurable: financial, strategic, and reputational. In the end, a picture of disillusionment remained. The attempt to force a conclusion led to a new chapter fraught with uncertainty. Was this the necessary endpoint of an overstretched conflict, or the prelude to an even more radical reorientation? The answer will not lie in the courtroom, in the sitting room. The case began with high expectations and ended with a clear boundary. A high-profile initiative, driven by moral urgency, clashed with a system that operates according to rules. The shocking opening in the courtroom set the tone. Emotions don't count, not sustenance. Even the statute of limitations became the decisive, insurmountable obstacle. The attempt to circumvent this hurdle by invoking a secret agreement failed due to a lack of evidence. What was intended as a saving grace only reinforced the impression of a fragile strategy. Simultaneously, the comparison with Prince William came to light, exacerbating the defeat. Two paths, two outcomes, an uncomfortable juxtaposition. With the substantive failure came the financial reality. The British cost principle transformed the defeat into a burden with concrete consequences. The moral claim suddenly stood in stark contrast to a sober reckoning. The price of the approach became visible and measurable. In the final act, the central illusion was revealed: the expectation of catharsis through the law. The courtroom offered no cure, but rather order. This order left no room for emotional compensation. What remained was the realization that personal truth and legal recognition operate on different standards. The future is uncertain. The conflict is legally over, but the consequences linger. Will this experience lead to a retreat or a realignment, or will it mark the beginning of further escalation on another front? The crucial question remains: what lessons will be learned, and to what end?